Most people imagine Vikings ruled by noise and violence, but the strongest weapon in their world made no sound. It didn't draw blood. It erased you while you were still breathing. Vikings are remembered for killing enemies, but they were far more precise with their own people. You could lose everything without being touched, and it was completely legal. Strength didn't keep you alive in Viking society. Being acknowledged did. Lose that, and survival became optional. Few myths mention how quietly this happened. People think Viking law was wild and emotional. It wasn't. It could declare you finished without lifting a weapon. After that, anything done to you no longer mattered. The danger in Viking life wasn't always a blade. Sometimes it was silence. No chase, no punishment, no drama. Just the slow realization that you no longer existed. Most people think Viking history is loud. Axes, battles, shouting warriors. But the strangest things about Vikings were never spoken about openly, because what actually controlled Viking society wasn't strength. It was rules people rarely noticed. Here are 7 Viking facts most people never hear about, because they don't fit the myth. And the deeper you go, the stranger it gets. Most people think Vikings solved problems with violence, but in many cases, violence wasn't the punishment. Silence was. In Viking society, being ignored was worse than being attacked. If a person was declared knightinger, dishonorable, they weren't chased. They were erased. No greetings, no trade, no protection. You could stand among people and legally not exist. People adjusted their behavior around this fear. They spoke less. They promised carefully. They avoided standing out. Not because they were weak, because survival depended on being included. This is how control worked. Not loudly, but constantly. This wasn't emotional. It was social death. And it worked. Because Vikings lived in tight communities. Being cut off meant you couldn't survive long. But this wasn't the strangest part. Most people think Viking law was chaotic. It wasn't. It was extremely specific. In some cases, criminals weren't executed. They were declared outlawed, which meant something precise. You weren't punished later. You were already dead in the eyes of the law. Anyone could harm you. No one would be punished. You had no rights, no protection. You were breathing but legally finished. This wasn't revenge. It was efficiency, and it made the threat permanent. But Vikings took this logic even further, and this is where it stopped being personal. Most people think Vikings valued brute strength above all, but reputation mattered more. A man known as unreliable was weaker than a physically weak man. Why? Because Vikings depended on trust. Raids, travel, trade. All of it required cooperation. If your word failed once, your future collapsed. That's why insults were dangerous. This kind of pressure didn't require force. It required attention. Every word carried weight. Every promise stayed remembered. People learned to monitor themselves before anyone else had to. That's how order survived without constant violence. Calling someone cowardly wasn't a joke. It was an attack on survival. And many duels didn't start over honor. They started over credibility. But even that wasn't the most unsettling part. Up to this point, this still sounds manageable. It doesn't stay that way. Most people think Viking children were raised to fight. They weren't. They were raised to endure. Children learned early where they stood in the household, where they slept, who ate first, who stayed closest to warmth. Hierarchy wasn't explained. It was felt. A child didn't question this. There was no language for it. By adulthood, this order felt natural. Not fair, not kind, just normal. And that normality shaped everything that followed. And once learned, it stayed. This wasn't cruelty. It was preparation. Because Viking life didn't reward emotion. It rewarded control. But control didn't stop at childhood. By the time a child became an adult, they didn't need rules explained. They had already learned when to speak, when to stay quiet, when to step back. This wasn't taught through punishment. It was taught through observation. You watched what happened to others. You learned which mistakes were remembered, which behaviors were tolerated, and which ones followed you forever. Over time, fear didn't feel like fear. It felt like common sense. People didn't feel controlled. They felt responsible. That's why these systems lasted. They didn't rely on constant enforcement. They relied on people enforcing them on themselves. And once that happens, a society no longer needs violence to function. Most people think Vikings buried their dead for honor. Sometimes they didn't. In certain cases, burial was punishment. Those who broke social rules could be denied proper burial, which mattered deeply. Because Vikings believed memory was survival. To be buried wrong meant being remembered wrong, or not at all. This wasn't about religion. It was about reputation after death. And Vikings cared about that intensely. But the strangest thing is what came next. This is where the myth stops protecting the truth. After enough pressure, people stop explaining reality. They simplify it, not to lie, but to survive it mentally. That's how myths begin. Most people think Viking myths were exaggerated later, but Vikings exaggerated themselves. On purpose. Stories were tools. People don't remember systems, they remember stories. Stories remove complexity. They make hardship easier to carry. And once a story replaces reality, the system that created it becomes invisible. Not to record truth, but to control how future generations would see them. Defeats were softened, failures reframed, brutality justified. This wasn't accidental. It was early narrative control. They understood something most people miss. History belongs to whoever tells it best, and Vikings told theirs loudly. But the final fact changes how everything else makes sense. Most people think Vikings lived brutally because they had no choice. That's only half true. They built systems that rewarded endurance and punished weakness quietly. Not with constant violence, but with rules, silence, exclusion, reputation. Once you understand that, Viking life stops looking chaotic. It looks controlled, harsh, calculated, efficient. They didn't just survive a brutal world. They designed themselves to fit it. And that's the part most stories leave out.